Welcome to the second in a webinar series, Asian Studies and Beyond in the Pandemic Age, sponsored by the Brown China Initiative and the Kogut Center for the Humanities 21st Century PhD series, with support from the Brown University Department of East Asian Studies. Today's session is called Research Problem Solving, Reframing Methodologies in an Age of Distance. It addresses the problem of access difficulties that the pandemic presents for fields dependent on site-based research, such as archeology, anthropology, art history, sociology, and more. And asks the question whether access difficulties specific to Asian studies that predated the pandemic are being exacerbated by present conditions. Our panelists will discuss some strategies for redesigning or adapting research agendas in light of such conditions, but furthermore ask how this juncture should prompt us to reconceive career markers and planning. My name is Rebecca Nadasta. I'm Associate Professor of History and East Asian Studies here at Brown. I'm going to go over a couple of logistics before introducing my colleague Kai-Jun Chen, who will introduce you to the panelists for today. First item of logistics, we are recording today. And the recording of this webinar will be up on the Brown YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks. So please keep that in mind. Our roundtable presenters will discuss a set of questions for about 1 hour, at which point around 6 p.m. we will open up to audience questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function of Zoom. And at around 6 p.m. we'll look at them and we'll sum up and address major thematic questions in the last part of the roundtable. So I'm very pleased to introduce my co-moderator today, Kai-Jun Chen, who is Assistant Professor of Late Imperial Chinese Literature and Material Culture in the Department of East Asian Studies at Brown. His research focuses on the manufacture of ceramics at court and the global circulation of handicraft knowledge from the 13th to the 18th century. He's published articles on craft and literature and the trade of luxury goods. His current book project, China Made, Rise of Technocracy in the Imperial Porcelain Manufacture, examines the Qing court's institutionalization of technical expertise in the ceramic industry during the 18th century. Before joining Brown, he worked at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and the Frick Collection. Kai-Jun.
Thank you, Rebecca, and for introducing me and then giving me the opportunity to introduce our distinguished guests. So we have 5 guests from all the disciplines, and Professor Tina Mai Chen is Distinguished Professor and currently the Head of History Department at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She is also the Acting Director of the Asian Studies Center. Professor Chen is an intellectual and cultural historian. Her interdisciplinary research deeply contextualized modern China in the globe across several time periods, from the Cold War era to the post-socialist regime. Her prolific publications connect various regions such as China, Soviet Russia, Burma, and North America, when she investigates the migration, the film exchange, as well as international circuits of gender. Professor Chen's work sheds light on the issues of gender, nationalism, and the representation of body. And Professor Chen's multi-regional and interdisciplinary research must have led her to many different kinds of exciting archives. And we all know that particular archives in particular regions may require extra effort to navigate. And it takes a lot of planning and maneuver to synchronize the research and writing with the uncertainty in these archives. And the pandemic completely change the already precarious connections among regions. And we are very keen to learn from Professor Chen's experience today. And from now on, I will call everyone by their first name. And Wai Chong and is the curator of Asian art and at Rhode Island School of Design Museum. She is extensively trained in East Asian art history in SOAS and later in Princeton, where she accomplished her doctoral study of the collaboration in Japanese paintings. Before she joined RISD in 2018, Dr. Chong held curatorial and research positions at the Victoria Albert Museum and the famous Percival David collection at British Museum and Harvard Museum of Art. She is an extremely generous colleague and also a prolific public educator. In fact, I missed one of your talks the other week, and I will ask you later. She is enthusiastically facilitating scholars and students' use of the museum collections. I know that Wai proactively overseeing the collections development and the cataloging and the exhibition of all Asian art at the RISD Museum, including both East Asian paintings and the large quantity of art in other media from Southern and West Asia. And as more and more museums around the world start to curate virtual exhibitions, we would love to know how our local colleagues want to make up for the drawbacks caused by the pandemic and perhaps take advantage of the new media and the new channels of education. Our third distinguished panelist is Sharon Domier, and Sharon received her graduate training in East Asian studies as well as library and information studies in both Canada and Japan. And since 1996, she has been working as the East Asian Studies librarian at University of Massachusetts Amherst after a decades-long experience in academic libraries at the University of Oregon, Ohio State University, and the Miyazaki International College. She develops the collection, improving the catalog and the reference, and passionately connects learners to the materials we need. Her own research interest focuses on the history of Japanese toilet, banned books and libraries, and as well as the culture and the ethics through picture books, Japanese monsters, and she also supports second language learners through reading collections. We are eager to learn from the peer librarians' insight into the current disrupt in the scholarly life and the measures they take to support the community's intellectual endeavor. And the fourth panelist, and we know each other, and then Dr. David Fitzgerald is trained in East Asian and East and Inner Asian history at Harvard University, and he is a historian of books and critical bibliography. I was fortunate enough to participate in one of his workshops on rare books back in graduate school at Harvard, actually. And after Dr. Fitzgerald worked as an Andrew Mellon Fellow of Critical Bibliography since 2015, he is currently the curator of rare books and the history of printing at the University of California, Los Angeles. He uses his 12 languages to build the collections and engage in teaching and research. As one of the founder of the Manchu Study Group, he sustained the organization and a journal, Saksaka. And he published many researches on, I would say, the management of information, including printed books, compiling archival documents, which I quote in my own research, and the channeling of paper trails. With his deep knowledge of printing and the books and their global migration to the digital world, and hope Devin and hope Devon can share his experience of a variety of social media with which he was able to facilitate intellectual collaboration. And last but not least, he just offered an online class of Manchu in the summer, and we would be happy to see him sharing the effective strategies in sourcing and in managing information when so many flows are cut at the moment. Our final and distinguished panelist, Professor Robert Weller, is a distinguished anthropologist based in Boston University. And he has been serving as the DGS in the past 5 years. And I actually attended a panel on geomancy that Professor Weller discussed in AS a couple of years ago. He received distinguished awards such as the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Fulbright Award, and his innumerable publications addresses various forms of religious practices in situ and their relations with social tension. But he also works on charities in China and Taiwan. He also published book-length studies on the globalization and the environmental culture in China and Taiwan. And since as early as 1982, in his early book, Power and Protest in the Countryside, Professor Weller has been putting East Asia in comparison with Europe and Latin America. One of his current 2 research projects focuses on the impact of nationwide geographical displacement on spiritual life. And the one case is based in Suzhou, and the other project explores the silence as the multiple potential meanings in any context and as it is involved in rhythm. It seems that Professor Weller's current research project may involve extensive field trips, and we wonder how the global pandemic affected or turned the crisis into opportunity for this kind of project. And we are also curious about Professor Weller's advice for his students who were to embark on new overseas research project. As I noticed that Professor Weller has been generous to chair or oversee several overseas academic committees. And we are very grateful for your joining us in sharing your experience. And I think Rebecca will ask an opening question.
Thank you so much, Kai-Jun. Thank you for those very generous introductions. So I have an opening question that's for everyone, and I guess we'll proceed by the now established Zoom etiquette that I'll pass the question to one person, and then that person who answers first can nominate another person on the panel to ask, and then so on and so on. So the question is, as Kai-Jun's introduction has already alluded, we've all spent the past months of 2020 making enormous adjustments as researchers, writers, teachers, mentors. Sometimes those adjustments have actually sort of allowed us an opportunity to pause and reflect when we get a moment to breathe amongst all those adjustments, to pause and reflect on our fundamental values, whether those come in a form of thinking about the kind of learning that we want to maintain and transmit, make room for, or a kind of institutional change that this time of emergency urgently requires and that we want to advocate for or also make room for. So I want to invite each panelist to start us off by describing a moment during the past year when you were working with a student or a colleague to overcome a research obstacle and it clarified to you one of these fundamental values. So maybe I'll invite Tina to start.
Oh, thanks so much. And, so such a great question, I think, to open a panel. I've been thinking about all the various moments and, certain ones just kept coming to my mind. And I think for me, as Kai-Jun said, I'm a department head. And so one of the conversations that seems to come up over and over again over the last year with my colleagues was everyone who was set to go on research study leave and were trying to make decisions if they should be postponing those leaves, whether they should postpone by 6 months, a year, simply cancel and wait for the unknown future. And one of the things I've been most struck by, I'm in Canada, as Kai-Jun also said, is the ways in which the idea of not physically being able to travel to your archive, or whether that archive was going to be opened or have limited hours. I was listening to my colleagues who work largely in North American or European archives, and at first, I could understand the anxiety around COVID. I couldn't really quite relate to the extreme anxiety over what if my archive doesn't look like I think it should when I get there, and what should I do, and what might this mean? And, and I kept saying to them, well, and so I was trying to frame this and I was being sympathetic, but I thought, wow, these are colleagues who the greatest crises they faced it so far have been things like Libraries and Archives Canada at one point used to be open 24 hours. And I remember when it closed to like only being open like daytime hours, and people were shocked about how this was going to affect their research output. And I kept saying, that's my fear, is that I'd have to be in the archive for 24 hours a day. So I was like, I'm not sure that's the way, but these were kinds of things. And we've done a lot of advocacy in the Canadian Historical Association on access to archives, but I was really struck, and colleagues kept saying, well, I don't know what to do. Like, how long, what's your advice on this? And I found myself saying over and over to different colleagues, well, stop thinking so much about the particular project that you're currently doing and ask yourself, what are the research problems and questions I'm really interested in? And then how can I go about doing those in this moment? Are there ways to reframe? What might I be able to do? And I kept saying, and if there isn't an answer that's foreseeable in the next 6 months, postpone your research leave, take some time to figure it out. But if there is some way that you can do that, and I think what was really interesting for me is I heard myself saying this, and then I said to myself, this is the advice for me as well. So I was also supposed to go on research leave on July 1st, and I was like, well, 6 months postponing seems the way to go. And, and one of the things in these conversations I was reminding colleagues of is, COVID, I think, is certainly disruptive to all of us, but those of us working in the Asian context and, particularly in the People's Republic of China, know full well that the ways in which access to archives have shifted so fundamentally over the last 15 years. What we're allowed to do, how we can access that has just shifted. And as a Canadian, for us, travel to China really hasn't been an option since December of 2018 with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the safety issues that came forward and restrictions and recommendations. So, I kept saying to them, well, this isn't, because they kept saying to me, well, aren't you worried? And I said, well, this is year 2. This is year 2 of these kinds of restrictions, and having to regroup and accept those contingencies as part of your research and just keep returning to that question of what is it that's driving my research? What is it I'm trying to ask and do? And so being less focused on cite certain people, certain documents, and more about what is it that drives me to try and find certain questions. And so I think, just as opening ones, I think, it's returned to me that really asking yourself, what is driving me to do research, and what are the questions I seek to answer, and how do I think that engages not necessarily just with the field, but with the politics of the moment, or how we would better understand the world. And because I think then there's the opportunity to respond to contingency, to really work around. Sometimes there's good serendipity. Sometimes in COVID, it feels like it's all just about, it's a little more reactive than proactive, but I think it really opens up spaces and allows us to think about our research, not necessarily in our narrow fields of expertise, but also how we might kind of reframe ourselves. So that's, for me, it's really about that kind of what drives us to ask questions, and what is it that we really want to find out about. And perhaps this time gives us a little bit of space to do that work. And I will now pass it to, I don't know who's nodding the most. I'm going to pass it on to Wai, who's been nodding. So I was assuming she's got something to say.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Kai-Jun, for the kind introduction. I was nodding a lot because I was agreeing very much with all the things that you've said, and like thinking too of like the challenges we've been facing at the museum in regards to our collection. And again, as you said, this fundamental way of thinking, right? I mean, as an art historian, I've always been trained to engage and look at the objects in person, right? Because you can never know until like you look at everything yourself in person. So you go to see the objects that you work with. And when COVID happened, I realized that this isn't going to be possible. We can't access those objects. We can't have in-person viewings, right? And so these are really big challenges that we face, because these are the things, the mantra that has been passed on to us and that we pass on to our younger scholars and those that come after us, right? Because how do we look at size and scale? How do we look at texture? And what about details and color? And that also was a problem for all of our colleagues at the museum who were going to teach with objects too, because that's one of the biggest, challenges we have. How do we teach with objects that we cannot bring out like we would normally do when a class, from Brown or from RISD or from any college comes to visit, right? And I myself, thinking back on one of the first classes I had to teach after, we closed down, was a class that dealt with the Silk Road. And so, and as you know, there are objects that's ceramics and metalwork and, all of these things. How does one show these objects, right? And how does one talk about them? And so I think like this has, gotten me to think a lot about, digital resources, as I'm sure most of you have had to think about that as well, and images and photographs, and how we can use that for our work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, I think. But I think I really appreciated how far we've come in terms of digitizing our collection. I really appreciate how much we have of like high resolution images and how we were able to draw upon that. And coming back, Tina, to your comment on like questions too, looking at those photographs and being able to zoom in on the details really makes you think about different questions to ask. Maybe these are new questions that we start to explore and investigate when we look at a different type of resource. And I'm not saying that, this again, crosses out all the benefits of in-person viewing, but I really think that we should start thinking about equally how important these other resources can be in terms of opening up new questions and reframing the way we think about these questions. So with that, I think perhaps I'll pass it on to Devin, if you.
Great, thanks, Wai. I think that makes a certain amount of sense to pass off to me, since both you and I work very closely with objects on a day-to-day basis. And I think the first thing I'll say is that for my community of bibliographers, book scholars, this year has, in some sense, been a really intense period of crisis. And there are two types of crises we're dealing with. First, there is a sense of loss because of this effective relationship you have with research and the objects you research. And I think we all have to acknowledge that going out in the field, working with the materials we love, talking to the people we care about, matters in ways that I think this year has really foregrounded for many of us, that there is an affection that drives many of us. And within my curatorial unit, many people have said, I don't even know what this job is anymore because I'm no longer doing what I thought I was going to be doing. Many of us are spending time in ways we never predicted and never would have agreed to if we had had an option. That said, I think that as both Tina and Wai have related, it has allowed us to start thinking about our research in new ways. For example, if we think about the notion of the facsimile. In Chinese archives for over a decade and a half, no one has ever actually been able to see usually paper documents, especially in the Qing archives. We've been interacting through computer screens. Those documents were taken away from us 2 decades ago. Similarly, all across the world, people are relying increasingly on digital repositories. So even before the pandemic, we were living in an age of facsimiles. And I think that this age of facsimile is something that we can problematize and allow us to reconsider information ecologies through the longue durée. People in the Ming Dynasty writing about Ming government were working with facsimiles of government documents printed in places like Nanjing, never seeing the original archival documents. And so existing in this cold digital world, I think allows us to start reconceiving what text and textuality means, how to start approaching texts, and beginning to develop almost a new discipline that's not DH, because there are people like me who will never learn Python, but something more in conversation with traditional bibliographical or art historical disciplines. Anyhow, I will pass off to Sharon.
I think of all of us, probably my job has changed the least in the last year. I was on sabbatical last fall at this time. And my research project was to figure out how I could support student second language learning without access to physical books. So I spent an entire semester in my pajamas learning how to buy or borrow audiobooks, looking for read aloud performances on YouTube, looking for digital books, and all kinds of materials so that students could, without having to go to Japan, surround themselves with language and hear it and see it and read it. So right when I was ready to come back and show people how to do all of this stuff, the pandemic hit. And I just did it over Zoom and the internet. So my job for the last 25 years has been to circulate among different small colleges and to support all aspects of Asian studies to the best of my ability with a very limited budget. You know, some years it would be like $3,000 to buy research materials. Some of you have your own personal research funds more than that, but that's what my library would give me to do that. So my specialty was cheap or free and weird, you know, and I gathered stuff to the best of my ability, going to Book Off to buy books for $1, and I would put them in my suitcase and bring them back for the students. So that's what I love. I love to help find stuff that people need. If they can go through the normal channels to find it, great. But if they can't, there's almost always a way that we can find it through connections, through backdoors, through calling in favors. And so that is what I do for people. And so let me pass it over to Robert Weller for his perspective.
Thank you. That was lovely, Sharon. I want to spend a semester in my pajamas too. My comments will probably be closest to Tina's just because my position in the academic division of labor is closest to Tina's. I am the director of graduate studies in my department. So the thing I immediately thought of with this question was graduate student crises as a result of the epidemic. And as I'm sure you all know, graduate students have had a lot of serious crises. In our department, it's very similar to what Tina mentioned in a history department. That is, it's research opportunities. We're social anthropologists. They go off for a year to do field work or for a summer to do field work. And none of that could happen. The summer, absolutely nothing was possible. the fall. So people have, you know, research grants where the foundation said, no, you cannot go, you cannot use our money. Or where the Human Subjects Committee said, no, there is to be no research on human subjects, no in-person research on human subjects. So they faced really terrible dilemmas. I liked Tina's like generic advice, which was, so think hard. Do you really need to be there? Or is there another way you can get at what the question is, whatever the fundamental question is you're after? But so the way Rebecca and Kaijun formulated this first question was, what fundamental values did this make us think about? So that's the one. It's Tina's question that it made me think about. That is, I'm an anthropologist in the intellectual division of labor of the social sciences. I feel like we're the context people. We're the ones, historians too, but obviously in a different way. But we're the ones who are about human life and all of its complexity in local places at specific times, the sorts of things that get thinned out completely by using digital resources. So for me, for my own work and the kinds of advice I would give to graduate students, it made me think again about how fundamental is that as a value that anthropologists should hold. And for me, it's still pretty fundamental. And having said that, I'm still happy to give graduate students room to come up with other concepts, because stalling, which is the only alternative here, stalling has bad consequences for graduate students, like they run out of money, which is not good. They have longer times to degree, which departments get punished for, as well as the students themselves. So all kinds of problems there. Nevertheless, for the moment, that's been the strategy of our specific students who are off to do dissertation fieldwork. Stalling has been the strategy, even though there are things that you can do. And I hope, that this particular part of the crisis ends quickly enough that they can stop stalling and do their work, and that we can find ways to deal with the problems that the year of stalling has created. For my own work, unlike Tina, this hit me at a relatively fortunate time. So I had been doing that fieldwork that Kaijun mentioned for quite a number of years at this point. I did deeply want to get back to China last summer to kind of finish it up. But anyway, obviously that didn't happen. That's been a very closely collaborative project with somebody in China who ended up in Canada for most of the duration, so that, in that sense, we were both out of it. Nevertheless, there are things that can be done. I think we, more senior scholars, have options that graduate students don't have. Collaboration options, right? You just can't write a collaborative PhD dissertation. Maybe citizen science sort of options that can be thought about, getting people to make maps, getting people to interview each other, right? There are all kinds of, I think, really underutilized techniques that we might are thinking more deeply about right now as a result. But for me, that, you want to know fundamental value, for me, it was still context. So I'll stop there, and I guess I don't have to pass this along to anybody.
Yes, I will pick up from there. And speaking on behalf of junior faculty members, and not far from graduate students, and I provisionally divided the source of information into three kinds. And as all of you just mentioned, one kind is the human subjects and the interaction in the field. And then there had already been a lot of uncertainties in that kind of research. And then you have the tangible artifacts, artworks, paintings, lacquerware, ceramics, and also, in the field. And the third kind is the books, our scholars' air and water. And I find myself cut from this air. I want the borrow direct back as soon as possible. So I will start from the most urgent question, both for junior faculty and for graduate students, is the changes in the library. So I guess my question will address David and Sharon. And as researchers yourselves and librarians, collection specialists, your work is based in the making the worlds of materials accessible in the whole range of ways. And what are some key ways in which the important part of your work has changed in the past year? And you've already covered, part of it, effectively. And you no longer have the access to the books and those discoveries in the field, but some immediate change and the ways in which we can make up for the kind of shortcomings. Yeah, thank you for your answering the question. Sharon, or
I will say that lack of access to books has been very painful for many of us. At the 5 colleges, Amherst College, Smith College, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, UMass Amherst, we have had a pattern for many years of not duplicating holdings. So if one library has it, then we borrow it from there, and they have cut our budgets considerably to move into other areas. Well, it doesn't work for electronic materials, right? It doesn't work for HathiTrust. The whole licensing issue means that we can't lend consortially ebooks. So we came, as always, there's a way of dealing with this, and we do drive-by borrowing, which means you get in your car and you go onto the other campus where you're on their IP address and log in using EduRoam, and then you gain access to materials. And so it seems ridiculous, but that's one of the ways that we have been handling this. And one of my faculty members drove down to Yale in order to gain access to the research he needed. Particularly in New England, many of you guys have the direct access using Columbia's collection, Princeton, Brown, Yale. At small liberal arts colleges, we have always recommended that people get an affiliate card with the big, Harvard. And so they're used to going to physically borrow materials, and they can't do that. And they can't gain access to their HathiTrust collection because of the login restrictions. So it's painful. It is really painful. And legally, we can't call in favors. But Interlibrary Loan is doing the best they can with requesting chapters of things. The books can't go out to you, but they're doing a lot of collecting of chapters and supplying it. And also Brown is probably the same, but mailing books to students if they are in North America. That lets your students who are in China or Japan or Korea without access to that kind of material. So I wish I had a happy answer for that. I don't.
So for me, before the pandemic, on a good day, I was, essentially like a Jeeves, where people would come into special collections and say, "Good sir, do you have this, Ovid?" And I would say, "We have that one and 84 other." And then I would bring them up and we'd have a good time looking through them and sort of discussing these sorts of things. And so obviously that interpersonal interaction is now mostly gone. And the sense of having any sort of control over the corpus of materials that I'm responsible for. And that's been one major change for a lot of us in special collections, is that now we're sort of all responsible for all the other special collections. so that my friends at the Ransom Center, what they're digitizing and making available, I need to know so that I can help researchers from UCLA and beyond find those materials. And so I would say over the last year, one thing I've personally been working on, and several other people in special collections, is trying to find out, create new ways to network databases or collections of digitized pre-modern materials. And some interesting things have emerged from this, which is that we have very, very strong digital collections at this point of things before, say, 1800. But from 1800 up to sort of 1900, especially for East Asian materials, you have very spotty coverage. And so actually the digital environment, it turns out to be fairly okay for pre-modernists. We can find this we can often find digital versions of the text we're interested in somewhere. But for people working in the late 19th up through the 20th century, if it's not on HathiTrust, there's almost no place to find those materials. And so, going forward, what I think we'll have to do collectively as a field is start really reassessing what we view as rare. The fact that we have many digitized copies of 16th century Italian books means that even though their market value is greater, their value as digital facsimiles is exponentially lower. And perhaps these things that are not under my control, say 1920s Los Angeles publications sitting on the stacks, should be digitized at higher rates than we're currently doing, and we should divest from sort of treasured digitization. And so those are some of the things that are coming to light.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon and Devin, for summarizing this change and some measures that you have taken to deal with it, and going forward to redefining and the priority for digitizing books. And this is also one way to develop the collection. I think one way to transform not just buying new books, but to make some more accessible. And yes, and then going from that, from book to another form of source and of information is the artifacts. And in the case of YE's collection, and in a nice day, on a nice day, I would go to your collection and say, do you have this ceramic? And you will show me and say, we have 4,000 more like this, and we will happily look at it together. This is not going to happen now. And so my question for YE is similar. What is the major change that happened in your collection? And then the methods, the digital or analog ways that you devised to develop your collection and make it accessible for the users.
Thank you. So yes, Kaijun, I still remember the last time you came in and we were pulling out, all those ceramics to look at together, and it's been a long time, and so we are still not able to do that, unfortunately, at the museum because of all the limitations on how many people can be in spaces together. But I think that this challenge has also made us think about the importance, like Sharon and Devin talked about, of digitization and how we share those resources and make available those resources. And I think that one of the great things about our museum is that we are able to offer everyone high resolution images, scholars and students, for no charge. So anyone that is interested in an object, we're able to provide high resolution images for them to study. And I think like making it free is really important, because I think it's really difficult for students to come up with like ways to access and to get things. And even if we think about what Sharon was talking about, the big libraries, right? The big schools where you have this service that's Borrow Direct. I miss Borrow Direct too. And once you don't have it, you realize, oh my goodness, that's such a luxury, right? And so I think that thinking about how to make our collections not just available, but affordable, I think is very important. So in terms of making it accessible, we obviously have a lot of our collection already digitized and available, but I feel that there's still a lot we can do. And the good thing about RISD is that, you know, we are able to upload personal photographs of objects. You know, they don't have to necessarily be high quality if we don't have them. So our, you know, sort of philosophy is to, as long as we have a picture, we will share it, and we will share it for free, right? And I think that that's a really important mentality to have right now, because like so much of our collection, you know, remains unseen. And if we don't even have a picture of it, how do we know what it looks like with just a description of Japanese bowl, 18th century, right? With such and such dimensions, right? So I think that any image helps. So in that sense, like I think a lot of us have been making an effort to do that, even if it's a photograph that we took on our phones, to try to get that up there, so that you know, that can be used and that can be studied. And in terms of what Devin said about books too, books are especially difficult to photograph because there's so many pages, right? Like rare books, and you know, they require a lot of attention, you know, in the way you set things up to photograph it. And but I've just been photographing them with my phone, and they're not perfect, but at least the information is there. And you know, and I make that available, right? So I think that, you know, one thing is to make as much as we can available and accessible, and then also at the same time focusing on high resolution and quality pictures as well. We're very fortunate to have gotten an NEH grant to sort of inventory and photograph a very important textile collection in the museum, the Lucy Truman Aldrich collection of 900 Asian textiles. Right. And as you know, textiles are very difficult to handle. They're very difficult, you know, to properly put up and photograph. But this grant allows us to take high resolution images and to also make that available online. And I think that while we're doing that, me and my colleagues, we've also been talking about the importance of getting things like object records, like provenance and historical records that are associated with that object, making all of that available as well. So, you know, in the future, we hope to be able to scan those things and make them available with the objects, you know, for future study. So these are some of the things that we think about. And of course, again, this is no replacement for coming in and studying, you know, the objects in person, right? But it's not meant to be a replacement. It's meant to be something that can help us to ask new questions and to have them complement, right? How we look at objects. And I think like the one positive thing that I can think of, right, in terms of this moving into the digital format is also that a lot of our collection has been used that way, in the sense that if you were to come in person and wanted to look at a huge object that cannot be brought out for you, or it's too fragile to look at, right? You can look at that now through the images. Like that becomes more available, and using those objects for teaching has been really, really successful, where we can show students a lot more things than we were able to before in person, because we can bring them out digitally, whereas we couldn't, you know, in the past because of the conditions, right? And with that, can I share screen for a brief moment to show all of you a project that I think like might also help us think about how we study artifacts and big sculptures. So last year we were visited by a Japanese scholar from the Tokyo University of the Arts who came to do a photogrammetry study of a big Buddha that we have in our collections. And for those familiar with it, you will know that this Buddha is 9 feet tall. And so it's very big, and it's one of the highlights of our museum. So using photogrammetry, which involves taking a lot of pictures and taking measurements from these numerous pictures, they were able to construct a 3D model of the sculpture. And this is something that the Tokyo University of Arts have been doing for a long time, and how their students in the lab learn about construction of sculptures and how they're able to, develop new conservation techniques. And so this website, can you all see it? Yeah. So this is their website, which I'm happy to share with you on the link. And they have done a lot of different sculptures all over Japan and in the MFA Boston, and also with our Buddha. And the resulting result of this, hang on, is something that looks like this. Can you see me moving the sculpture? So normally you would only be able to see the sculpture like this in the gallery, where you will, you can't see the back of the sculpture because, there is a wall behind him, right? And as I said, he's very big. It's like 9 feet tall. But with this, students are able to just engage with this 3D object, right? And able to, and then think I'm going to stop sharing at this point. This opens up a lot of avenue for thinking about how these technologies can help us, in terms of artifacts and objects and how we study them. But I also think it opens up conversations with other fields, right? Because in order to do this modeling, we interacted with a lot of computer sciences and also people that were able to piece together that data, right? And also and conservators as well. And the questions that these people ask are very different from questions that we ask as our historians, right? And I think that, again, this helps us to think about how we can collaborate and how we can have more interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about our research. And so I'm hoping that, this opens the way in terms of how we think about what we do. And I would like to echo something that Kai-Jun mentioned earlier too, about travel and time and limitations, with that and what that can benefit us, right? And if we think about all of us in different locations now being able to meet on Zoom and have this discussion, if we were to do it in person, it would have involved travel, hotel bookings, costs, etc. But we are able to meet in a more efficient manner. And in this way too, to think about collaborations and how we can talk to each other and share resources and knowledge, right? I think would be a way to think about how we conduct research in the future. And to your point, Robert, about the single person PhD, I was just talking to a few of you earlier before the roundtable started about, again, why don't we start thinking about joint publications like they do in the sciences, right? In the humanities, we always think about the single author approach. But isn't it time maybe that we start conversing with our colleagues in other fields that are experts in what they do, and think about questions together that we can answer, and start publishing together. So with that, I think maybe I will pass it on to the next question.
Thank you so much, Wai. And thank you. I see one of your colleagues, I think it must be Maureen O'Brien, sort of supported this collaborative spirit in the Q&A. by thanking you for your creativity and generosity as a colleague and teacher. So, which is I will say, please do start to put questions and comments in the Q&A. I think what we'll do now is head into sort of the last question for all of the roundtable, so that we can have some time for any audience comments. But I think I want to follow up on this, maybe with some more specificity, this question of collaboration, but then also other kinds of institutional changes and institutional supports that actually need to happen to enable people to do their work in this moment and then going forward. Collaboration is actually something that is of great interest to one of our sponsors, the Kogan Institute for the Humanities, which has been developing for a number of years now a graduate certificate in the collaborative humanities, and then offers now undergraduate as well as graduate classes in the collaborative humanities. So they're trying to think about actually what that can mean for instruction, but also kinds of graduate training. But various of us have more experience, and Rob, you have extraordinary experience as doing collaborative research and writing. Others of us have experience in informal collaboration in terms of when it comes to the level of sharing of materials, and I think maybe a lot of people are turning towards that now. Through these informal networks as a way of solving this problem. But there's all kinds of institutional sort of issues behind these, that's already been alluded to, who has the money to get the materials in the first place, who has the access, who is in what network, who ends up as first author in a collaborative article, and so on and so forth. So, I think we can just maybe end up with sort of posing the question: what sorts of institutional changes would you like to see in the circles that you move in? Would you sort of advocate for your colleagues, for example, to start to think about in order to support the people that you want to work with? I don't know, Rob, would you like to start?
The problem will be getting me to stop. I'm really pretty committed to collaborative work of all kinds. So I've done it in more theoretical kinds of books and in a very interdisciplinary way, just with other scholars here in the US. I've done it horribly badly. I've done it in ways that I'm really proud of. I've done it with the sort of research that creates data sets that can be shared, and I know some of the issues involved in that. The current project I'm doing is collaborative in a sense I've never done it before. That is, actually the fieldwork itself has been completely collaborative. Like, we'll interview somebody together, which has all kinds of unexpected benefits. She's a woman, I'm a man. She's a lot younger than I am. She's Chinese, I'm not Chinese. And the ability to play with those subjectivities rather than just being stuck with who we're stuck being has really opened up some possibilities that just aren't there otherwise. So I think I know how to do collaborative writing well, but it's hard. That is, you have to be willing to be challenged. You have to be willing to have your stuff rewritten. I don't mean you write chapter 1 and I'll write chapter 2. I mean, you really think together. So it's time consuming. It's hard. It involves reading together before you can do anything. But it's the best way of doing things. Is it the answer to COVID? No, but it certainly can be helpful. as a way of moving on. So I'm not sure where else to go, but I would really be open to questions about it.
Thank you. Actually, I do have a follow-up question before we move on. Is actually, how do you find mentoring graduate students, and does any of this translate into how you mentor graduate students, or is this, do you still feel that there's a divide in how you will practice collaboration, and
So
how your graduate students have to still write that same kind of dissertation?
So the fact is, you still have to write a single authored dissertation. Chemists, physicists, you know, every physics article has 50 authors, but every physics dissertation has one author. So, you know, even for natural scientists at that stage, it's not collaborative. But what they can do and should think about as graduate students is the future collaborations. All the rest of their career where this becomes a possibility, you start building those ties immediately. And it starts simply with taking other scholars' work really seriously. You know, in the field, and especially in a place like China, right? We all know a lot of Chinese scholars who occupy similar positions to us. We need to read their stuff. We need to work toward collaborations, even if it's not the project of the moment.
Thanks. Devin, do you want to follow up?
I also saw Sharon had something to say. But I would say that, you know, one of the freeing things about being in what we call an alt-ac career is the absolute freedom to collaborate as wildly as I want, because much of my work is co-written or co-authored, and the library really gives rise to that sort of capacious thinking. Particularly because, you know, every individual is really responsible for more than any individual could possibly be responsible for. And so, for example, in my job, I am the curator of every pre-modern book from everywhere in the world. So, I mean, that means I have one of the largest collections of Islamic manuscripts that I'm partially taking care of, as well as Armenian materials, then East Asian, and then just Europe. And so that just means that to thrive in that sort of environment, you need close collaborators of all sorts of different stripes. And so back to what YE said a couple of years ago, myself and one of our programmers here 3D scanned 78 Chinese wood blocks. And so we've been using them to print books. And so, you know, those sorts of things come up naturally in the library. And I think the problem with it in other academic positions is that we still haven't done a good job working out how that helps people obtain the sort of career security that I no longer need to worry about. You know, many multiple authored articles may not look good in some tenure granting institutions. I know Ben Wong had to really fight to get UCI to take Nourish the People seriously, which he wrote together with Pierre-Etienne Bills. And so in some ways, it's this moment of crisis provides us an opportunity to say, look, our graduate students are going to be slower and they're going to need more support. And also what we're doing on the back end as already tenured faculty have to be rewriting certain rules about what constitutes research and standards. And to be perfectly frank, strip the white nationalism inherent in these standards out of it, because these are fundamentally, and I believe this strongly, and I'm a librarian, so I can say it, you know, white nationalist practices that recognize only certain forms of expertise.
Devin, I cannot second that more. I too have to deal with, like, you know, an Asian collection that spans, like, you know, Islamic miniatures to like to East Asian objects, and without, you know, advice and constant, you know, consultation with my colleagues, there's no way, I can specialize in all those areas, right? And I think that, again, the museum is great in terms like we have the flexibility to co-author and to collaborate, and we do that, very frequently with our colleagues. In fact, that sculpture that you just saw, that I just showed you, I just wrote that article with our conservator Ingrid, right? Who understands it because she worked on the sculpture and disassembled it a few years ago, right? And I don't have that expertise. So I think, like, now's the time that we really need to address, like, maybe the institutions need to address what kind of value they put on these types of knowledge, because we're all experts in different fields.
Yes, Tina.
Yeah, this is such a great conversation. And, I'm so happy to join and think about the way that both in light of the COVID moment, but kind of larger trends in the field around what institutional changes kind of are necessary. And I completely agree, as we all sit in institutions, rethinking the ways in which so-called productivity is measured. So, and what counts as good work and what's valued are really important. I think COVID has only highlighted those and the disparities. And, living up in Winnipeg and in Canada, one of the conversations that's been ongoing, but intensifies, I think, every year, are questions of, how do we recognize Indigenous research? How do we recognize work in community? And I think Robert's already kind of talked to this. When you're working in community and you're building those relationships, you're always talking with people. It takes significantly more time, and it's always premised upon relationship building and relationships, in multiple ways. And that institutions are pretty slow to respond to what that means and what it looks like as a final product. And, the more I always think about this, and one of the things that I've been trying to advocate quite a bit for at a university, beyond the, extend the tenure clock in the short term, all of these things, which I think at least all the institutions in Canada seem to have done. I don't know what's happening in the US, but that was done very quickly. And they were just like, but, we all know 6 more months or 1 more year actually doesn't account for the fundamental shifts that we've been talking about today. But, I think really the questions that kind of come to mind around collaboration for me, and I've always done collaborative work with people, and I think it's perhaps because I start down projects that I quickly run up against the limits of my knowledge and skills, but I've already got too excited about the project, and then I have to find people who can, help and collaborate and be part of a team and help me around to different, multiple sites and do things. And like Robert said, sometimes I'm really proud of how they turned out. Sometimes what I've learned is, maybe I should have gone about it a different way. And sometimes I have to admit, sometimes my collaborations are very strategic. And particularly, as I've moved through my career, the strategic collaborations are often about identifying, and this often happens with colleagues in China who really need to, for their own careers, the assistance of being able to be on an article that's, published in North American journal or in a different journal, or they need to have and they're at stages and they say, can you collaborate? And some of these are not necessarily that deep-seated collaboration. They're about sharing some research and thinking through the materials, but in many ways also accepting an analysis that comes from outside of the way that I would study the materials and thinking about what can I do in those roles. And so those I think of as the strategic collaborations. And they're different than the co-writing and the things that Robert talked about. So when I look at this, what I always think is that we need a kind of more nuanced way of where we would all feel comfortable being honest about the nature of the collaborations that we've done. So, because, I know which, co-authored articles were extensive collaborations. I know which ones actually are single authored, but were built upon and, completely dependent on, my colleagues and friends and those that I worked with all across different parts of Asia. And that, acknowledgements page and that footnote are completely not significant enough, right? It's that in the end, I wrote the piece, but it's really not really about my work necessarily. It's about all that work that went together. And so, the more I think about it, to me, the solution is for all of us kind of collectively to keep pushing for the importance of really strong peer review, for the role that we play for each other in being able to understand the value of work, and, to keep moving against what is really a global movement around things like metrics, counting, citation, the things that take out, and this is again to go back to I think Robert's context, that take out the context of the production of our work, that simply want to quantify and sort of, list things. And I think we need to really work and think about the value of us as a community and a sort of people who we collaborate not only in the work we do, but in defining what has value in the field. And that's where our power is. And so institutionally, it's about, being the advocates for that kind of evaluation, for standing up for it at all levels, graduate student work through the rest, but it's also about kind of, committing to doing that work with each other, and the way that review sits there and being able to really take the time and allowing people to be honest about strategic versus deep-seated versus the different kinds of collaboration and how it shaped our work, and why things took time, and not to be judging things on a kind of time, how long, but really what is the value of the work along the way. And as I always say to friends, and also the value of the work that doesn't get done, the value of the work that gets disrupted by war, pandemics, other things, but there's still being intellectual work and collaboration and kind of things happening, and that we have to also learn to value that and figure out how being comfortable in expressing that we've done that work as well, even if it doesn't, turn out to be the book with the really nice cover that we all should celebrate as well. We should, but that we shouldn't only celebrate those. So I think institutionally, I think it's a big job, but I think it's one that we have to kind of commit to in those different modes.
I have a little story, if I have permission from the organizers.
Yes.
It's a very short story. So one of my more recent books, called How Things Count as the Same, I wrote collaboratively with a colleague in the religion department at Boston University. And the year it came out, when it was time for the chair to recommend merit pay raises, the chair calls him in and says, "So how much of this book is your contribution?" to my colleague. And he says, my colleague says, "I wrote 100%. And the chair says, "Well, what about Weller? What did he do?" And my colleague says, "Weller wrote 100%. And he's totally right? So what he meant was, without both of us doing everything together, there's no book here. But I think when Tina's saying, these metrics, oh, I wrote 41%, so that's, give me that much credit for it. It doesn't make sense for certain kinds of collaboration. It's the natural science model is mostly what you call that strategic one, right? That, oh, I know how to count the number of scales on a snake, so I get to be a co-author because I counted the scales, which is fine, right? I think that's perfectly good, but we need to distinguish that one from this like totally collaborative kind of thing. We don't even really yet have the language to do it. Thus the ridiculous conversation that my colleague ended up with. But we need, I think our first job, our here meaning senior faculty members in our different departments, is to find that language and then to force our colleagues first at tenure votes to take this kind of work seriously. And then as we're serving on or writing reports to broader, higher level tenure committees, to really to make the case that collaborative work is just as important in history and anthropology, in our history, whatever, as it is in physics.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think also the ethics and responsibility of collaboration, right? And I think I was saying beforehand to some of you that one of my fears, of course, is that as we have less access to physically other places in the world and to resources, that we become more, the importance of building relationships and responsible relationships with colleagues who might have access to those, to think about them. And as Robert said, all that reading and work that you have to do together to truly collaborate, as opposed to, I have these fears of, in the days when we couldn't get access, or if, people didn't go to Asia regularly, that, people looked for quote unquote native informants, people who could tell them what was happening on the ground. And also, it was no surprise that these are often racialized and gendered interactions. Certain people do the labor and provide them, and we take the information. And I think these are, so really thinking seriously, what are the responsible ethical modes of working with others? And then also, like I said, sometimes being honest. I mean, they work in all different ways. It's not always the same for each project. And, asking, working with the researchers in different ways where it's a research related collaboration. It's about helping find materials, and you're really working through them or different ways, but always being able to be really conscious about what it is you're asking and how you're doing the class, and whether it's a collaboration, a partnership, a kind of, shared responsibilities. These are all different models. And I think we have to think about how they're all possible at this moment, and probably in many ways necessary to keep some research projects going, but that there's an ethical responsibility we all bear to be honest about the mode that we're working in, and to think about also if there are kind of, these inequities that we're either perpetuating through them, or whether we're actually helping to counter some of the ones that are being exacerbated at the moment.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think there's a imperialist sort of collaboration. You gather the data, I'll provide the theory, I'll do the significance. And I desperately want not to do that, But I think anybody who even starts down this road needs to be very self-conscious about the dangers of that, and not to let that happen.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Sorry, and yeah, regarding this ethnical, the ethical concern and the power relation in the field work, but in other kinds of work, I have a follow-up question for Tina. Is so, all of you, know how it has changed in this pandemic situation. It seems the Zoom and those online channels sometimes have a democratization effect, and then the person who was not able to attend certain lectures or event or workshops now empowered by these tools, and they can attend. But is there any pitfalls of this new effect, and the kind of new impact of the new tool that we need to be aware of? And yes, and I hope my question makes sense.
Well, I think, the line I've been giving to everyone is and talk to people, to kind of interact with people, has increased for those who have access to, online in particular modes. But that again, of course, is not equal. And, the one part, and I suspect that all of you are going to agree with me, because I think, Devin talked about that affective relationship with the, the objects, the sources, the people. It's the whole part of it. And that, so what we don't get in these is that we gather like in this fantastic group, but on a topic specific to talk about things. So it already has this privileging way of those who are ready to articulate, or at least want to listen to others articulate their positions. So that kind of other ways of forming connections, of bonding together, of why you've come together, those are very difficult at this moment. And I think we would all recognize that even if our research is driven, whether or not it's, anthropology, and you're sort of working in a community, it's always driven by these parts. And that when we get online for Zoom, it's always for a purpose, to watch and do something. And so the kind of the spontaneity, the serendipity of encounter is just not there. And I think, and often those who are less well represented in our communities where inequities are, they are also the ones who then we will miss hearing, seeing, and reaching from. So they may be able to listen to us, but how we form those relationships, I think, become more difficult. And I think that's something just to be attentive to and aware about, so that, I'm not sure how we fix it, but there really is that Zoom is about gathering for something to talk about something.
Maybe just then to follow up and as a way of concluding, I've been thinking too about what the next couple of years are going to look like in terms of the potential of a wide range of people who are in one way quite privileged in the sense that they may have graduate degrees, graduate training, but they may not have a position. And so they may actually not have access, to the research channels with which they were trained in graduate school. And so what are how maybe especially from the library side, or actually even thinking about undergraduate students who have an interest in continuing work, research, who are cast into, this ocean of an uncertain economy, and are cast out of this sort of, I think a lot of people are looking at universities now as a sort of safe environment in a lot of ways, economically and in terms of resources. I see a whole bunch of questions coming in now, just all of a sudden. Now it's 6:25, but maybe we can get at those. But like, how should we be thinking, especially libraries, be thinking of working with these people, who will be in this sort of interstitial space where they actually want to continue intellectual production, but they don't have, they won't have this access to the institutional resources necessarily. And there may be quite a lot of these people.
I think from my perspective, it's long past time that we talked about this. Most of the people who are graduating with a PhD in China studies will not be hired at an R1 institution where they will have access to what they had. They just won't. They're going to end up, if they're lucky, at a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, or someplace, where they're the only China person at their institution. They may be in a city working full-time and then being an independent scholar. They can still have access to many things, but they will have to negotiate some of it. They will have to, if they're at a liberal arts college, they will have to negotiate with their dean for research funds, because they'll never have access the same way their colleagues in American studies have access. If they're lucky enough, if they're an independent scholar and they're in a big city, they should be absolutely utilizing the New York Public Library, the big public libraries. There are resources for everyone. At the same time, libraries are working really, really, really hard to convince scholars to publish in open access journals. Look at the journals, look at where you are putting your scholarship, put it in your institutional repository, make it available. Just recently in Japan, they've opened up Japan Search with really high quality digitized images from hundreds of museums and art galleries. So for China studies, the books are being digitized in Japan, and they are making trilingual access websites. So there is so much opportunity out there, and there is nothing stopping you from writing good research on good topics and making it available.
Maybe then I'll pick up on a couple of questions that have just come in the Q&A regarding one came in regarding open source documents and Chinese archives that may be very specific, and I might recommend to the person who asked that, I think contacting a specialist librarian who knows something about archives is the best way to go. I think what we'll do is, as a follow-up to this webinar, I will be circulating the recording when it's available to everyone who's registered as a participant, and we can send along any useful links on that. So like Sharon, if you have something you want to share.
I just very quickly wanted to say the Chinese studies librarians in North America have worked really hard to negotiate temporary access to hundreds of databases. Not available to everybody because you have to be able to use a VPN and do that kind of thing. They are also sponsoring webinars on archives and digital access. So yes, find a specialist. I will send out links for it. They have really good information for you right now on gaining access to collections. And they will always introduce you to somebody who knows something. That's the thing about librarians. They don't make it up, they look it up and they connect you.
But one other question came in, and this is, in a way, it's not a pandemic question, but maybe a question about one exacerbated by the pandemic, and that's about the ethics of collaboration in sensitive research, sensitive political times, and it's then the question was framed at to what extent in doing so do we endanger collaborators, research collaborators, and so I wonder if any of you just have any final thoughts on that. It's obviously like a question that cannot be answered succinctly, but maybe you can. Okay, Rob, you can answer it succinctly. Thank you. Please go ahead.
I had been hoping to say something about it anyway. So I would say, first of all, I'm not as worried about endangering my collaborators. I feel like my collaborators in general have a better sense of what's safe and what's not safe than I do. And I'll trust their judgment on those kinds of things. Although if I feel like something's going over a safety line, I won't go there either. Having said that, the situation's gotten worse, and this is pre-COVID. The situation's gotten worse, especially under Xi Jinping. It's gotten progressively worse, but it is COVID related. So one of the problems is we're monitored, right? Facial recognition software follows us everywhere. There are all kinds of other ways in which movements are monitored. And now that everybody has their COVID app on their phone, and you have to scan that app basically everywhere you go in China, people are monitored, us and everybody else are monitored much more closely than we were before. And it affects the kinds of research we do, the questions we ask, the big questions, but also the like face-to-face questions we ask. I don't like that feeling of constantly having to worry about this question, but you have to constantly worry about this problem of are you endangering anybody and how not to do so.
I think that's extremely salutary, and it reminds me of Tina's remarks about sort of bringing us back to fundamentals and asking what kind of research questions you want to answer and what kinds of, it's sort of like what kind of person do you want to be in the world and in the field, because obviously this has a particular political framework and technical framework in China, but as we've seen, COVID has allowed for the expansion of those kinds of policing powers and operations in many situations around the world, and in our own countries as well. So, these are questions that all of us, again, to go back to the earlier theme also of that this is quite, a discussion that we need to be having with our colleagues seriously and often, is a very salutary one. So thank you all so much for this really helpful and stimulating discussion. I appreciate the time that you've given to it, especially at a time of the fall where we're all kind of running on fumes. But I think that I think that you've given a great deal of both practical help and kind of like reorientation to our audience. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, Kai-Jun.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to meet all of you.
Yes,
Thank you
thank
so
you,
much.
everybody.
Thanks for organizing it.
We hope the conversation will continue offline. I'm still typing answer to some.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. Feel free to linger as long as you like. But, also, feel free to have a wonderful Friday evening. And thank you to the audience.